Welcome to the second module in Edu 510. In this module, we're going to be considering your research problem, literature review, and ethics. In this module, you'll be reading two chapters from Creswell and Guterman, who provide a detailed look at coming to your research problem in Chapter 2 and literature reviews in Chapter 3, for both quantitative and qualitative research. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco take on the complexities of doing qualitative work and consider the complex ethical positioning of the research and the researcher, as well as the centrality of ethics to qualitative research. I'll talk about the other authors in a moment, but in addition to the readings that are listed above, you'll be participating in the forum, as well as completing your statement of the research problem assignment, for which there's a separate video. And you'll find that either above or below where you found this one. In other words, this is a busy module, and so staying on top of it will be important. But remember that I'm here to support you in any way that I can in doing so, so just let me know if you need some help. Alison Brophy and Helen Raptis are both non-Indigenous, based at the University of Victoria, and are interested in working cross-culturally to support students from JKK right up to adult learners from all cultural backgrounds, but with a particular interest in Indigenous learners. Their article is especially important in thinking about the ethical positioning of non-Indigenous researchers working with Indigenous peoples and communities. In this paper, they take on the necessary characteristics and ethical positions necessary for non-Indigenous researchers to research sustainably and in a way that breaks down colonizing patterns of interaction between cultural groups. Andreas Ekström's passion is digital equality. That is, he hopes to see a world in which wealth is shared, not only financially, but in terms of knowledge and influence. He's a Norwegian journalist, author, and digital futurist, and his TED Talk pushes us to think critically about how knowledge, particularly digital knowledge, is produced, and what are the ethics of that knowledge production. His video is a fascinating look at thinking critically about the trustworthiness of the knowledge upon which we rely. This is a video that, while brief, is well worth continued reflection. Julie Bull, who is the author and presenter of the video that has been recommended for you to look at, considers the possibilities and ethical complexities of working with Indigenous communities. And by that I mean communities that are reserve-based and urban-based. For example, in education, we could be talking about research with schools in Indigenous communities, as well as Indigenous students attending schools off reserve from nursery school to post-secondary in more urban settings. Julie Bull is Inuk and a powerhouse who works with government agencies and in academia based at the University of Toronto. Her primary interest is in the ethics of doing research with Indigenous peoples. Her video is a masterclass in the history and policy background of ethical positions in relation to Indigenous peoples. Well worth watching closely. It's really excellent. Perhaps the most difficult and important step in any research project is deciding on what we are actually trying to research. Creswell and Guterman provide us with some key questions to ask ourselves as we carefully consider the specific problem area of interest we are considering for our research. These are questions you'll be considering in your assignment as well, so let's just have a quick look at them. First of all, what is the specific problem, controversy, or issue that you wish to address? Why is this problem important to you and perhaps to others? How will your study add to what we already know about this problem? And who will benefit from what you learn about this problem? We'll talk about what each of these problems means both in this video and also in the video about your research assignment. So just keep them in the back of your mind, and Creswell and Guterman will remind you of them as well. Some of you are beginning to consider the research problem that will eventually become your research question that you might explore in your research project. As Creswell and Guterman suggest, coming to your research question is a process, an essential and important process that is comprised of several steps. We'll begin that process in this module through your readings and the assignment you'll engage in during this module. So let's look at how that process evolves. First, Getting from a general topic of interest to a research question is a process that moves from the general to the specific. In my own case, for example, for my doctoral work, I began with the general area of interest in the gender equity policy in education. The research problem was the resistance to the implementation of gender equity policy in school systems. And that's because I was teaching a course, and one of the areas that we looked at was this new policy on equity, the new equity policy in educational organizations around 4 issues, including that included gender. The other 3 issues were accepted, but gender seemed to set off a particular kind of very vehement sort of resistance. And I felt it in my class. I felt it sometimes in casual conversations out in the public because it was a new policy. And so, of course, it was being talked about other places as well. So I really became fascinated with why was it that this particular area of the policy was being resisted to this degree. My purpose then was to study how resistance was manifest in school systems. So that's where I wanted to locate my research, and that's what I wanted my research to do. But I had to make it researchable, so I had to come up with a question that would help me achieve that purpose. And the specific question I explored was, what are the forms of resistance encountered by gender equity officers in implementing gender equity policy in educational organizations? And I picked them because they were right at the nexus, so to speak, between the policy, the implementation of the policy, and people who were receiving that resistance. And as it turned out, that turned out to be an excellent location for the study that I was looking at, or that I was interested in. Creswell and Guterman provide another good example, and I've got it here on the slide, where the topic is online learning. So perhaps the researcher is somebody who's implementing online learning in a college or a university or some other kind of a location. The research problem is the lack of students enrolled in online learning. So keeping in mind that a topic is not a research problem. The problem has to be located in the topic, but the problem is, what are we going to do? What's going on here? What are we going to do about this? We have to solve this issue. The purpose statement then related to that research problem is to study why students don't enroll in online classes at a community college. So we have a researcher located there, or somebody comes in to do that research from the Ministry of Education or whatever. And so their topic is clear, their research problem is clear, their purpose statement is clear, but how are they going to make that researchable? So the research question then is related to a particular aspect of this problem and of the purpose. Does the use of the internet deter students from enrolling in an online class? Is that what's going on here? And so it's one aspect of the issue, probably coming out of something that instructors are observing or people are hearing in the office where students are enrolling or whatever. So that then becomes the question that is asked. So we've gone from the general to the specific, and you might move around in there a bit as you're going through this process, but nevertheless the general direction is general to specific. And what may appear to be a fairly straightforward process can take a considerable amount of time. So don't kick yourself because it's taking you time. It really is, in some ways, the most difficult part of the process. And one of your tasks in this course is to begin that journey of identifying your research problem and gradually moving closer to identifying your research question by going through these stages. In doing so, you'll be better prepared to commit yourself to a research question when you begin your next course, and you're going to have to do that quite quickly. So working through this during the course will be helpful to you. Part of writing a statement of your research problem is locating where it is situated in the literature. What do we already know about it? What do we not know? How will your research contribute to the literature? Creswell and Guterman provide good advice about doing your literature review, and because the information they share is explained clearly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here regurgitating their excellent advice, other to say other than to say in Chapter 3, they discuss the literature review and consider the practical steps in identifying the focus for your literature search, locating literature, critically evaluating and selecting the literature you're going to use for your research, then organizing and writing up your literature review. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco also take on the literature review in Chapter 4 of the readings that you'll be doing in a very different way, but there's nevertheless some good information there, and they tie it much more specifically to ethics. So in addition to their excellent advice, I'll just suggest some practical tips that may be helpful. When you identify the key terms for your research, you might want to find them by considering a potential title for your research, or come up with a sentence of 25 words or less to distill your ideas to their key components. You can then build your keywords from there, and that will help you with your search. Once you put together some key terms, you can begin to locate the literature available. And here's where you need to get to know your librarian. I think her name is Carolyn, actually. They'll be your best friend. Any of the librarians are wonderful. So get to know the library and get to know the library website, and use the ask me a question box, because there's actually a real person at the other end of that question box. So you're not going to get canned responses. You're going to get real responses to your question. And they're willing to and able, very able actually, to help you out. But see the cautionary notes and instructor notes as well, as consider Ekstrom's video discussion about judging the trustworthiness of knowledge and knowledge that's available, and in our case, in academic literature. In order to find reliable and useful literature, use reliable and useful sources, ones that are peer-reviewed, that have an editor and editorial board affiliated with a reputable university, for example, that are quoted regularly in articles about the particular topic you're interested in. And that is, evaluate the quality of the literature you're identifying, as well as its value to your study. And you'll need to evaluate whether this article, which may be very worthy and interesting, actually enhances your understanding of your research problem or question. Then you need to organize the literature, discuss potential ideas. So those ideas might include things like digital organizers. And your librarian can tell you about the kinds of organizers that they would recommend. And they used to have them available through the library. I don't know whether they still do or not, but they may be helpful. You can set it up on your own computer just by establishing, and what I used to do actually was just put the letters of the alphabet in a list. And then when I found an article, I would put it in, like, let's say the author's last name started with an R. The first author's last name started with an R. I put it in the R list. And it was a quick way to alphabetize things. And so if I found another R author, I just, put it above or below that author, so that I kept my list alphabetical. And in addition to the reference that you'll want to include, and that's a good way to practice your APA skills too, you'll want to put down a couple of sentences that talk about why this article is helpful to you. The other thing you can do as you go along, as you're reading the article or you're reading the book or whatever it happens to be, and you come to a quote that's just seems to be something that you might want to use later, put it in your list. So, and with the page number, always with the page number, please, with the page number, so that you can use it. You can use file cards. You can use digital organizers and systems. Put them on a big chart on a wall. There are all kinds of ways that you can do it, whatever is going to work for you. You'll be glad you did when you're finalizing your last edit of your research project and discover a quote that has no reference but is essential to the point you were making, and you don't know where to look for a reference, so you spend most of 3 days locating it. Ask me how I know. So don't get yourself in that position. I really don't want any of you to have to deal with that. The annotated literature review assignment that's upcoming will also be helpful in enabling you to begin to go through this process in a more limited way, but it will enable you to explore one way of writing up an annotation for each literature source as well as the synthesis, when we'll eventually do a synthesis of all this literature across the literature chosen. And that's a skill that you'll use in your research project as well. So this assignment is going to be helpful to you. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco talk about ethics in terms of big E ethics and little e ethics. Now, they have an extended discussion about it, but one way you might want to look at this is institutional ethics and personal ethics. So big E ethics are the institutional research board's ethics, for example, or in our case, the University of Alberta's ethics review board. I was a part of that review board for a while, and what we're concerned about in that position are the codes of conduct that are expected from researchers, and we get those through various federal bodies, actually, and the university has to answer to those federal bodies, and they're actually inspected from time to time, and you don't know when those inspections are happening, and it can have we can have serious repercussions if, in fact, those codes aren't being adhered to. Things like that participants are informed, unless there's extremely good reasons for them not to be, that participants need to be anonymized, unless, again, there's extremely good reasons for them not to be, and so on. So there are lots of ways in which there are significant expectations around that. And you'll learn more about that in the ethics course that you are expected to finish before you complete your degree. One of the things also that they're concerned about is protecting against liability concerns. And this is something that supports the researcher as well as the institution, because if a researcher gets into a jam, some kind of legal jam because of something that's happened, and as Marshall and et al. Suggest, sometimes research is very, very ethically complex, and there may be room for some kind of legal response. The institution will protect the reviewer or the researcher if their review has been approved, but the process protects the university because they can say that they followed all of the steps and this was, an anomaly or whatever. So it's kind of a win-win situation. And then we have small e ethics that are embedded in everything we do as researchers. So we can think about it in the ways that Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco suggest when they say ethics require a focus on matters of relationships with stakeholders, with peers, and with the larger community of discourse. We remind you of the words respectful, fair, and caring. Ethical research practices grounded in the moral principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco take on the particular ethical complexities of doing qualitative research and argue that ethics is part of everything that is done in qualitative research, as we've mentioned before. Because qualitative research is a complex area of inquiry in which concepts are constantly contested, its methodologies and methods can be complex, but at their heart, they are premised on relationships with participants and stakeholders, and sometimes in very complex social contexts. Transparency is essential then in order for the researcher to, as fully as possible, understand their positionality in relation to others, and particularly in relation to those they are researching. This requires a strong and well-informed sense of ethics, and as Marshall et al. State, viewing the moral principles that guide research practice as relational rather than merely as a procedural hoop one must jump through, and that's, the big E ethics, centers of the inquiry on people, which we argue is where it should be. Just remember those simple words: respectful, fair, and caring. And when these three come together, they comprise a level of trustworthiness that needs to be the goal of qualitative research. So let's look at how ethics are central to working with Indigenous communities, and we'll see a good example of this. Brophy and Raptis, as well as Bull, argue that decolonizing research is carried out by those with particular values, ethics, and morals that are necessary to ensure sustainable research with Indigenous communities and Indigenous populations. As educators, we are challenged then to reflect carefully on the moral and ethical components we bring to our research with Indigenous peoples. Brophy and Raptis explore the literature and draw on several Indigenous scholars, including some from the University of Alberta, who outline those ethical characteristics. Sorry about that. First is responsibility and trust. That is, a researcher will keep information confidential and will be accountable to the community. Next is humility. That is, they're respectful, willing to place the needs of the community above their own, and they don't rush to judgment when actions are different than their own values would generally support. Rather, they accept these actions as fulfilling the needs and values of the community. A broad worldview helps the researcher understand that there are many ways of being in the world. And reciprocity is key in light of the terrible history of many researchers in the past. Instead, research interests must benefit both the researcher and the community. Relational accountability is another key value in which reciprocity, trust, and respect come together, in the sense that we are all connected to all things, and therefore there is a moral responsibility to ensure that no harm comes to the community, and all of this requires deep listening within relationship. And last is self-identity, that is, an awareness of oneself, knowledge of who one is and why the research is being done. And this has direct implications for the research methodology and how that is negotiated with the community in their interest. Julie Bull provides a briefer version that encapsulates the Brophy and Raptis paper in a way that's, I think, probably easier to remember and very important when she lists the following as essential to ethical research in Indigenous communities. She argues that there's a need for respect, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationship. And all of these are key ethical components of doing research in Indigenous communities. As a teacher and researcher in Indigenous communities, I fully concur with all of these characteristics. And I would add, too, that research needs to be not only relational, but invitational. That is, it encompasses trusting relationships built over time that are beneficial to the Indigenous community and that are highly reciprocal. Hostetler, who wrote an article that we used to use in this course, actually considers the question, what is good research? And I really can't, this quote just stuck with me and I want to share it with you. Up until now, our readings, for example, Creswell and Guterman, have suggested that good research is research that is methodologically supportable. That is, something that we could recommend as being done correctly or corresponds to best research practice. Now, Marshall et al. Trouble that and push on that. But Hostetler asks us a much more philosophical question. What is good research? He asks this question from the perspective of an education philosopher whose research specialization is the study of ethics. And he makes a statement near the end of the paper that summarizes his discussion and raises broader possibilities for research in a larger philosophical and ethical sense, particularly as we look at some of the philosophical and ethical questions related to research in Indigenous communities or with Indigenous peoples. And he says, as education researchers, we have a particular obligation and opportunity to take a leading role in seeing that the research that is done is truly good research. As we do our work, we need to think beyond questions of how we will study students or analyze school policies. We need to think about how we can make life better for people. We need to think beyond our taken for granted ideas of well-being and what is good and make those ideas the objects of serious communal inquiry. Serving people's well-being is a great challenge, but it is also our greatest calling. His statement challenges all of us to consider this central ethical question. How will my research make life better for my school, my community, and the wider society? As you consider your research problem, I hope you'll be considering that question as well. And I welcome your questions around anything in the video or anything with regard to your assignment as well. All the best.